Boy, 7, says he's alive at Dad's funeral. Then police discovers the truth. The chapel was quiet except for the soft creak of wooden pews and the rustle of black coats as people shifted in their seats. Outside, the wind scraped against the stained glass windows, a hollow sound that made the candles flicker along the walls. Grace Collins sat in the front row, her hands clenched around a folded tissue that had long since torn at the edges. The pastor's voice echoed faintly, speaking of rest, peace, and eternity. Grace heard the words but couldn't hold on to them. Her eyes were locked on the dark casket at the front of the room. She tried to imagine Michael inside, but her mind wouldn't let her. It was easier to picture him at the kitchen table, leaning back in his chair, laughing about something on the news. Only now, when she walked into that kitchen, there was still a half-empty mug on the counter. Coffee stains circled the rim. He'd always wiped them clean. Beside her, Ethan swung his small feet back and forth, too short to reach the floor. His little suit jacket bunched at the shoulders. He tugged at her sleeve and whispered something she couldn't quite hear over the low murmur of the pastor's prayer. She leaned down, catching the words as he spoke again. He asked why they closed the box. Grace's throat tightened. She told him quietly that Daddy was sleeping now, that they had to let him rest. The lie burned as soon as it left her mouth. The organist began to play a slow hymn. People stood, some weeping, others blank-faced. Grace stayed seated, staring straight ahead. The sound of her own heartbeat filled her ears. Something in the air felt wrong, too heavy, too still. When the hymn ended, Ethan suddenly stood on the pew. His voice broke through the silence, clear and small. He said his daddy wasn't dead. The room froze. Every head turned. Grace reached up, pulling him down, whispering his name in panic. He pointed toward the casket, his eyes wide and certain. He said he saw it move. Grace looked too, her breath caught in her chest. For the briefest moment, she thought she saw the fabric inside shift. Just once, barely enough to notice, but enough to steal the air from her lungs. After the funeral, people gathered in the church basement for coffee and pie. The smell of brewed coffee filled the room, but Grace could barely taste the sip she forced down. Everyone spoke in quiet voices, the kind people use when they don't know what else to say. A few neighbors patted her shoulder, saying how strong she was. Linda, her oldest friend, tried to lighten the moment, whispering that kids say strange things at funerals, that Ethan probably meant Michael would always live in their hearts. Grace smiled politely, but the words slid past her. All she could think of was Ethan's face when he said it. He hadn't looked confused. He'd looked certain. At home, the air felt too still. The house smelled faintly of Michael's cologne, a scent that clung to the hallway. Grace tucked Ethan into bed early, but he kept his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. When she kissed his forehead, he whispered that he could hear Daddy calling from the garage. Grace froze, her breath shallow, but then she smiled softly and told him it was just the wind. Still, when she turned off the light, she left the door open. The night stretched long and restless. Grace lay awake, listening. Once she thought she heard a faint scraping sound from outside, a metallic tap that stopped as soon as she sat up. The silence afterward pressed against her chest like a weight. Morning came gray and heavy. Grace poured cereal for Ethan and stared at the mail on the counter. A sympathy card sat on top, written by hand. She opened it, and a small photograph slipped out. It was Michael, smiling beside his car, taken just a week before the crash. He was wearing his wedding ring in that picture. Grace looked down at her own hand, remembering that the ring was gone when the officer returned his belongings. She went to the hallway closet and opened the box marked with his name. Inside were his wallet, his keys, and his old jacket. She reached into the pocket, and her fingers brushed cool metal. When she pulled it out, she froze. It was the ring. The one he'd never taken off. The one they said had burned in the wreck. Grace sat in her car outside the police station, the engine idling, her fingers gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a few patrol cars lined along the edge. She took a deep breath, stepped out, and walked inside. The air smelled faintly of coffee and dust. Behind the front desk sat Officer Grant, the same man who had come to her door the night they told her Michael was gone. He stood when he saw her, his expression polite but uneasy. Grace handed him the photograph, then the ring. His brows knit together. He said it wasn't unusual for personal items to turn up later, that crashes scatter things. She told him the coroner's report didn't make sense. He hesitated before saying the case was closed, the identification confirmed. Still, his eyes avoided hers. That night, Grace sat at the kitchen table, papers spread around her like fallen leaves. She compared the times on the coroner's form to the police report. Something didn't line up. The coroner had listed Michael's time of death almost 2 hours before the rescue team even reached the car. She traced the red pen under the numbers again and again until the ink bled through the page. In the corner, Ethan drew quietly. He used a black crayon to sketch a box with handles and red lines across it. Grace asked what it was. He said it was Daddy's box and that Daddy's hands hurt from pushing. Grace felt the color drain from her face. Later, she stood in the doorway of the garage. Michael's old toolbox sat open on the workbench, a faint smell of oil and metal in the air. She reached out and touched the handle. It was cold, but not as cold as she expected. For a moment, she thought she heard something, maybe the faint echo of a breath, but it was gone as soon as she noticed it. When she went back inside, Ethan was awake again, sitting at the window with his blanket around his shoulders. His voice was calm, almost sleepy. He said his dad was waiting. Grace didn't answer. She just turned off the light and listened to the quiet hum of the house. The sky hung low and gray the morning they returned to the cemetery. The ground was soft from overnight rain, and the air smelled of damp earth and wilted flowers. A few officers stood near the grave, their boots sinking into the mud. Grace stood a few feet away, her coat pulled tight around her. She could feel the weight of every breath she took. Officer Grant was there, clipboard in hand, his face pale and tense. He asked her once more if she was sure. She nodded without looking up. The workers began to dig. Each scoop of soil thudded against the ground with a hollow sound. Grace stared at the dark opening widening in front of her, her hands pressed against each other as if to keep from shaking. Ethan stood behind the yellow tape, holding on to Linda's hand, his small face expressionless. The minutes stretched. Then the metal of the coffin appeared, slick with rain. When the lid was pried open, the air seemed to stop moving. Grace turned her head away, but curiosity pulled her eyes back. Inside lay a man dressed in Michael's suit. His face was still, his skin pale, but something was wrong. The hairline looked different. The hands were larger. Grace stared at them, stronger, rougher hands than Michael's. Her throat tightened. That wasn't him. One of the officers leaned closer, lifting the man's wrist to remove a watch. Grace's heart pounded. Michael's watch had a long scratch across the glass, a mark from the day Ethan was born. This one was smooth, untouched. The officer looked at Grant, and for a long moment no one spoke. Grant finally stepped back, rubbing his forehead. He ordered photos, samples, paperwork. The air was heavy with confusion. Grace could hear her pulse thudding in her ears. She looked over at Ethan. He was calm, too calm, his eyes fixed on the coffin. He whispered something to Linda, something Grace could barely hear through the wind. He said that wasn't his dad. He said his dad was still cold and waiting. The words hung in the air like fog. Grace couldn't move. She just stood there as the rain began to fall again, tapping softly against the lid of the empty truth before her. Grace sat in the small, windowless room at the police station, the steady hum of the fluorescent light filling the silence. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers knotted together, the skin raw from worry. Officer Grant entered, holding a thick folder. He didn't sit right away. He just looked at her, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. Then he laid the file on the table and opened it slowly. Inside were photographs, reports, and a single plastic hospital band. He told her the DNA results had come back. The man buried in the grave wasn't Michael. The test was conclusive. Grace blinked, trying to process the words. Her mouth felt dry. She asked who it was, but Grant shook his head. They didn't know yet. He turned the folder again and pointed to a document near the back. A nearby hospital had reported an unidentified man admitted days after the crash, unconscious but alive, found near the site. The man had severe burns, but the paramedics said he still had a pulse when they found him. Somehow, somewhere between the scene and the morgue, a mix-up had happened. Grace pressed her hands to her mouth, her heart racing. The report said the man had been declared dead by mistake. His pulse had been too faint to detect. A locked-in episode, the doctor called it, a condition that made him appear lifeless, even though his heart was still beating. Hours later, Grace walked down a long hospital corridor, her steps echoing softly. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air. She pushed open the door to a quiet room. Machines hummed steadily. A man lay on the bed, his face bruised but familiar. She moved closer, her hand trembling as she reached for his. The fingers twitched beneath her touch. Slowly, his eyes fluttered open. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he whispered her name, faint and cracked, but real. Grace's tears spilled before she could stop them. Ethan climbed onto the bed, his small hand finding his father's. Later, as the sun rose over the hospital parking lot, Grace stood by the window watching the light spread across the sky. Behind her, Michael slept peacefully. Ethan laughed softly in the chair. For the first time in weeks, the house inside her heart felt whole again.